Hello and welcome to week 4 Ad and PR Account Management J364 Online. As always, I'm your instructor, Michael Betker, and this week we're going to talk about branding. One of my favorite topics to talk about in this class, and obviously, like we've discussed already, branding, there are agencies out there specifically focused on branding, which, like I've talked about, is actually kind of evolved into something a little bit more robust. And why is that? Because these brands are valued extremely crazy high in number. So we're going to look at that. I think the first thing you want to do is obviously watch this video. And you're off and running, but I'm going to go through kind of the details of branding. Should take about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there's a couple of videos I'd like you to watch as well. The first is the top 15 global brands ranking. Kind of fun to watch that evolution. What it is a time lapse from 2000 to 2018. You may have seen these before, but it's about a 5-minute video, and you kind of watch the evolution of certain brands, the rise and fall of some of these brands. And then, of course, we're going to pivot once we talk about brands, specifically about with businesses and products. We're going to kind of cleanse the palate, and then we're going to move to what I'll call the personal brand workbook exercise for this week, assignment number 2. Toward that end, I'd like you to also watch, before you do that, I'd like you to watch the video, a TED Talk video, about 17 minutes long, starring a guy named Scott Dinsmore and his personal story about how he kind of discovered what he likes to do the best. And that's kind of what we're doing sort of in an oblong way here, is self-discovery. And that personal brand workbook is meant to uncover and unlock some of the personal brand stuff about you. And that really will be something we want to kind of focus on this week. So that's it. Let's get pressing on here with the lecture for the week, which is about branding. But before we do that, I want to kind of quickly mention this. Obviously, Valentine's Day is this week, the 14th, so happy Valentine's Day to everybody. But from a marketing standpoint, and I teach this in other classes as well, Valentine's Day, you'll probably see lots of ads like these here. There's just a couple I grabbed from the web here, but ultimately it's called an aperture moment. And I guess as account people, we're always thinking about kind of opportunities to have a story told about our brands. In this case here, you've got Snickers and, of course, our all-time favorite Starbucks coffee ad here. But either way, they're capitalizing on this aperture moment, which, of course, is a holiday we all know and love. Some call it a Hallmark holiday, but generally speaking, February 14th is a day people talk about quite often. So, all right. So let's press on here. But anyway, that's kind of one thing I want you to be mindful of, the fact that these types of days allow you to tell a story and make people receptive to that story. All right, let's talk about branding. So it's been around for a long, long time, as we know, right? It's an old Norse term, which means to burn, fire, or it also means the word sword. That's brander. It's an old Norse term. Back in the day, obviously, we knew brands were used more sort of strategically to protect your investment. In this case here, cattle, right? So cows were branded so they could be differentiated by owner. So lots of times you share tracts of land, and sometimes cattle tend to commingle. Or worse, some cases your cattle would get outright stolen from somebody, and of course the brand was a way of saying that's my property. So that's how it early on evolved. Around that same time frame, obviously, and this is, again, I'm taking a lot of liberties here with history, but as we know, here in the Industrial Revolution kind of spawned a lot of different brands, and the best example I can use, and in fact in this lecture I'll be using car brands as some of my examples for branding. But it started out pretty simply, and it was pretty easy to launch a brand back in the day. And you look at all the brands. One of the things I want to mention is just this idea that when you start out, when something's new, there tends to be a lot of proliferation. So in the case of the automobile industry, early on, you see hundreds and hundreds of brands, over 500 different brands at minimum, back in the early days when cars were new, beyond the Ford sort of initial introduction of the vehicle. So back then it was easy to establish a brand. Today, here, flash forward now, you see far less brands. And that's usually what happens in most categories. In fact, all categories start, if it's a big category, it'll explode with brands. And then over time, you'll have this bell-shaped curve where the backside and brands tend to dissipate over time. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to all lives of brands. Why is that happening? Well, parity of products, right? So a lot of times now when you buy a car, and I would say there's certainly quality issues still at play, but parity is a problem, which basically means, there's not a lot of difference between car A and car B in a lot of cases now, or product B and product A. So companies must work really hard and diligently to establish their brands in whatever way they can. And usually it's some kind of innovation that does that. So more on what a brand is. It's an effort to give a unique identity to the company's products and create emotional associations with consumers. That's kind of the key, that emotional connection. And this is kind of a compendium, this picture here, of different brands that we tend to know and love. I see Starbucks in there. I see Coca-Cola. I see GE. I see CBS. I see Apple. I see a few others as well. But that is kind of each one of those brands elicits sort of an emotional response in us. For example, let's talk about Apple for a moment. I love Apple products, as many people do. It creates a sort of thought in my brain, and we have multiple Apples around the house now. I'm sort of an addiction for us. But that's kind of what they hope for when you cultivate a brand. And Apple has certainly done a really good job of creating what I would call brand disciples, folks who would take a bullet in the chest or maybe in the leg for the brand. A brand is a set of associations that are linked to a product, range, a division, or a company. So it's pretty broad. And these associations reside in the memory of consumers. So these memories are long-standing, right? So over time, a brand is built over time, as we'll see here in the successive slides. So it's a slow burn, but eventually branding kind of results in some feelings that are elicited in their target audience. And they really stand for a few things, like what the brand or company is all about, why it's potentially relevant to the person, how it is different or similar to other products made by the company, and how it's similar or different from competitors' products. So it's a way of differentiating yourself from your competitive set. My good friend Seth Godin, he's not really my friend, but I read a lot of his books. A brand is the set of expectations, memories, stories, and relationships that, taken together, account for a consumer's decision to choose one product or service over another. And that's what branding really does. It creates this decision set. And what you really want to do, this is high level, but is create a space in the brains of target consumers that says, all right, if I'm going to get X, I'm going to get that brand. And I've got an example coming up here in a second here. But essentially what you're trying to do is carve out a space with your brand that's unique to itself. And we'll talk about BMW, but that's one example. BMW's tagline was always known as the ultimate driving machine. So really BMW was able to kind of tie itself to driving, and expert driving. And if you ever driven a BMW before, I can tell you, these things seem to almost have a mind of their own. So they hug the road, and if they're in good shape, you really get the idea that the brand and the tagline for BMW is consistent with the product. And that's kind of what he's driving at there. What does brand mean? A brand is a perception resulting from experiences with and information about a company or line of products. So as we'll see, it's not just about the products. It's also about who you talk to and your experience with any what they call consumer touch points with the brand across the spectrum. That's why IMC campaigning is so important. We talk about that as being an important part of our campaigns when we do our advertising campaigns, but even by extension there, consistency with branding is important for the long-term goal of and health and well-being of a brand. Branding is defined as the process of creating a brand image that engages the hearts and minds of consumers. What is a brand? A singular idea or concept that you own inside the mind of the prospect, like I mentioned, right? So it's the one thing that really separates you from everybody else. In case of BMW, because of their branding and their marketing and advertising, carved out a space with the word driving, owning the word driving. Now, just ironically, BMW kind of got away from that for a while, and they realized their mistake shortly after and came back to the ultimate driving machine again. But they let it lapse for a while, and you'll see in the video I've got here where they show the brand. Watch BMW kind of rise and fall as a result of that decision. Al Ries, one of my favorite authors, also said market share is not based on merit, but on the power of the brand in the mind. So again, it's how we feel, that emotional connection we have with the brands we love. There's BMW, right? The ultimate driving machine. An old school ad there on the left, and on the right hand side. And this is a kind of a personal brand story for me because long ago, now I don't ever have the money to buy a brand new anything of any note, but I do like luxury driving cars. So I've always been buying cars, used cars that are in good shape. And my BMW, which recently kind of died on me after almost 300,000 miles of driving, 530i, 2002 BMW. I love that car. But I had a brand connection with that product because it was just an awesome experience, and I right away understood what they were talking about with the Ultimate Driving Machine. But know that branding, people can be fickle as well. So because I'm a shopper, I actually, when my car died last year, I had to get a new car, and I was shopping around. And I test drove a lot of cars, and ultimately settled on this car. And I bought this car on Facebook. It's my current car, the Infiniti M35. That's, reasonably high miles. 130 some odd thousand miles, or 143,000 miles you see there. I paid exactly what you see there, $5,500 for this car. This is the parking lot where I bought it from the guy right there on the spot. I plunked down $5,500 in cash and drove it away right off the lot there. So an interesting, different way to buy the car. But long story short, I fell in love with the car, and I love it to this day. And it's great for a lot of reasons. So we'll talk about that brand more. But obviously, I still love BMW, and I would certainly drive a BMW again. But I've managed to defect my thinking here a little bit based on my experience with this other brand here. So we'll talk about it a little bit more. So this is kind of a lead up to what we're going to talk about with branding. But how does Infiniti brand themselves? Now, Infiniti's has not been around as long as BMW, right? BMW is a long-standing brand, as is Mercedes and a few other luxury car brands. Infiniti's the new kid on the block, right? The new kid. That's the key word there. Just a quick story on this. Obviously, 30 years forward. So they started in '89. So this is actually 31 years old. This site's a little bit dated, but you get the idea here. See the pregnant woman here. We'll watch this video in a second here. But this sort of shows the example of what I want to talk about here is this fact that this is the new kid on the block, Infiniti. And I love the logo too, by the way. Just the idea of this infinity, right? This endless road, which really, really is a great logo. One of my favorite of all time, I would say. Just showcasing the brand. So not a lot is needed to say there. You don't even see the word infinity here in this case on the car itself. It's not needed. The logo does its own work that way, and that's called visual Esperanto. Frankly, when the image does the work, the heavy lifting for the words. So let's take a look at this statement up close here, 30 years forward. 30 years forward, the past, present, and future of Infiniti. After years of top secret preparation, Infiniti was announced to the world in 1989, like I mentioned, and instantly revolutionized the automotive industry. And it did. While a lot has changed in three decades, Infiniti's dedication to driver-centric design, innovation, and an unwavering belief that luxury should be lived in has continued to drive the brand forward. And I'll say it, the car I have, the M35, is not the highest. It's not a Q50 or anything like that crazy, but it certainly is a luxury car, the nicest I've ever driven in my lifetime. So this is how companies sort of brand. So let's take a little deeper dive into this, right? So I'm going to go to the website here, and we'll just kind of look around a bit. So let's watch this video. What do you say? So I think there's a video here. Let's see. Oh yeah, it's in our history. Oh, what drives us? Okay, here we go. And brands will often do this too, that this 30-year or 40-year, 50 or 100-year are again aperture moments to tell the story, the branded story. Again, young family here. Again, a lot of young. So their target audience obviously is young folks, in this case millennials, I would say. Young family members and young groups of people. Hashtag 30 years forward. Pretty cool. So that's branding for Infiniti, and obviously you could play around with this if you wish. But some of the things kind of spring out of here. One thing I've noticed is they don't really have a tagline necessarily, and I don't know that they need it. We'll talk about taglines in a minute, how they kind of embellish upon a brand. But some of the kind of things that Infiniti stands for, what drives us, is what they say here. Powerful elegance. So in other words, and again, I would say if you look at the inside of any Infiniti, you'll see it's really a very clean design, but also these cars have some horsepower to them. So power and performance, empowering technologies and human connectivity, and of course then the story. So all of these things kind of roll up to what Infiniti is. And like I said, they were an entrance in the market. They came in, and Nissan was actually going after the luxury market with this new brand, and they did quite well with this entry. So quality certainly matters, I would say, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm a convert to from BMW to Infiniti. So I mentioned that they don't have a tagline necessarily of any note that I can find anyway. It's just essentially it's Infiniti and it's the logo. But other brands, big brands. So this is kind of how you would think about each of these brands. Let's take a look at some of these here, some of the ones we know and love very well. Nike, right? Been around for a long time. We know probably one of the most popular U.S. brands. Tagline there, hard to beat, just do it, right? And in every case, when you look at a brand, you look for those short calls to action, or those short statements that really reflect the emblem and the brand you see. This slogan was created by Dan Whedon of ad agency Whedon Kennedy in the 80s. It worked incredibly well as a motivational line in accompanying the sports brand, but it was also actually inspired by the last words of a murderer awaiting execution. He just said, just do it. So the guy was about to get killed by a firing squad. That's where it was inspired from, just do it. Kind of interesting little story there. Apple, think different, as we know, right? That's started in 1997 and saw a huge boost in sales in its stock price. But that idea of thinking differently was kind of part and parcel of the brand itself. And you watched commercials and everything else, and it sort of was a game changer. And Steve Jobs obviously heavily involved with that branding and that effort. Calvin Klein, I don't know if anybody still wears those jeans, but back when I was a young person, the statement "nothing comes between me and my Calvins" was popularized by Brooke Shields, one of the actresses of the day, and she's now in her 50s, like I am, but that certainly was a tagline that sold a lot of jeans for Calvin Klein back in the day. Of course, Adidas is lesser known to Nike's Just Do It. Impossible is Nothing, so probably not as well known. And again, Nike has done a really, really good job with their advertising and with their kind of global efforts regarding that. But so that's just a couple examples of how brands kind of position themselves and how they say what they say about themselves and how the taglines kind of fit. What does brand mean? What a brand does, let's talk about that first. The first thing it does, it differentiates a product from its competitors. So as we know, again, looking at this slide here, we see Nike versus Adidas, a slightly different approach there. Of the two, I would say Just Do It does have more of a call to action, and you see Just Do It ads, and Just Do It will never probably change for Nike. Impossible is Nothing, again, in indomitable spirit sort of positioning there. But either way, I think you've got two different versions of the same truth when it comes to athletic equipment. Makes a promise to consumers, right? So the promise, it's called the brand promise. And what that says, basically, again, getting back to the BMW piece, you're getting the ultimate driving machine, right? So you know you're going to get a tightly created, highly engineered piece of machinery that is built for driving. And then the last one here serves as the driving unifying force directing all functional areas, including IMC. So essentially, it's the buck stops here, right? We'll see some examples upcoming of the value of these brands, but that's because people have to actually watch out and make sure you're not doing anything to sully the brand, to hurt the brand through any advertising efforts. So you'll have folks who wear the brand hat at every company who will be always kind of overseeing what's going on in the day-to-day activities of any company. So obviously it's important for us to kind of think about brand in longer terms, a longer view of how the brand will proceed. One thing people don't often think about here, and I guess we're coming up on another election cycle here, just coming November 2020, there's a tendency to think of most brands in terms of tangible product categories like soft drinks and breakfast cereal or whatever. But I'll say this, if you want to think about marketing and advertising on steroids, watch the upcoming election. And I would say this, say what you will about the Trump-Pence campaign round one, they certainly did a credible job. And nobody believed that they were going to come through and win. Hillary was a juggernaut and seemed like unbeatable almost in a way. Obama also ran a great campaign, but you get a feel for really what they do with these brands is they really push these brands and this idea of hope for Obama. And moving forward with Hillary, of course, Make America Great Again, the obligatory MAGA call to action, which I think believes now CAG, Keep America Great, for round two here. Either way, these are clarion calls and they're taglines and they're brands, right? Same thing as what we've seen in products. So let's break it down a little further. I would say this: marketing folks can find jobs, legitimate jobs within politics as well. In this case here, it's a really interesting race shaping up in 2020. Now, president's been impeached and acquitted already, so he's off and running here. And obviously, we're still in the election cycle kind of shenanigans that happen up to and including November. But I want you to understand this. First, let's go back to 2016. All right. So, question is, why did every top pollster and pundit get the 2016 election wrong? I mean, it seemed to me as though Hillary was going to win, right? Well, here's a response to that. I would say the Trump campaign did a better job of reaching out to key target audiences in a meaningful way. And when I say key target audiences, swing states, right? The ones that we happen to live in. For example, Wisconsin was a swing state. Michigan, Ohio, and a few others, right? Minnesota even. But that was his focus, and obviously had a message that really was on target. So from a branding standpoint alone, even though 538 gave Hillary a 71% chance of winning, and somebody even said, Sam Wang, the election consortium, said he would even eat a bug if Donald Trump won. Well, guess what? Wang later ate cricket on CNN. So most folks did not believe that would be possible, but that's the power of branding. So that's kind of the takeaway here, and you're seeing today this analysis promises to be a powerful tool against, again, this election. So we're looking at this now again. Trump's got a head start on the Democrats. Democrats seem to be floundering a little bit as they kind of find their way, but once that kind of gets past that point and the Democrats pick a champion for the Democratic brand, you're going to see a lot more of this branding going on and targeting. Usually through social media is what's happening now, as we know, and then some of the dark side of stuff in social media, where you get some disinformation. And just read that Facebook has agreed not to litigate or prevent people from putting out evidence or talking about stuff in a truthful way. So in other words, they're not going to say, if it's not truthful, we're not going to let it print. They're going to just let it go. So it just basically means that all bets are off. So if you're on Facebook and you're seeing something, take it with a grain of salt on both sides, Democrat and Republican. They're both going to be doing this type of marketing and branding. And it's big business, obviously, right? People in marketing, advertising find themselves working a lot of times in campaigns. So as we've seen, pivoting back to kind of the regular brand you see in politics, you've got these branded messages that include logos. So we know what a logo is, right? That is a distinctive graphic design used to communicate a product, company, or organization identity. Here's three big ones here: Nike, Starbucks, and Ben & Jerry's. The cool thing about these brands is this is called aided versus unaided awareness. So this is kind of, I would say, aided awareness. So if you see a portion of a brand, like for example, the golden arches, right? Kind of dead center here on your screen. We see those golden arches. Even just a swoosh of that will tell us that's McDonald's, right? That's the power of the brand. And over time, it becomes imprinted on our brains. So a lot of these brands here, you probably know if you look through these here, like Fila, for example, lower right corner there. Adidas, certainly, Pepsi, some of these other ones maybe you don't know as well, but Kodak and a few others. But these brands are encapsulated within these logos. So let's break it down a little further. What is a brand made of? It's not just a logo. Like a lot of people believe it's just a logo, right? So it's a trademark. These are legal properties, and that's what you call these things. They're called trademarks, and usually you'll see a TM or an R, depending on the status of the trademark. But they're legal properties, which means they can be litigated against and they can be protected. They usually also include a mission statement of some kind, and this is a reminder what the brand stands for. Usually doesn't change too often once they've got that basic idea. And it's also, a lot of cases, a logo or a slogan, and these are what we'd call your signature. So in other words, it's what you say about the brand. Again, Just Do It for Nike, the Ultimate Driving Machine for BMW, and many others. It's also a product or a service. Obviously, it stands for something. It's something they're trying to sell or trying to create value for their brand, for their company, their constituents. And these are the tangible things you get with a brand, right? So you think about BMW, automatically your mind goes to a four-wheeled vehicle of some kind. And then, of course, advertising is a part of that as well. And that's kind of the thing you do on a regular basis to continue to push the brand in a number of ways. And PR factors into that as well, but ultimately you're delivering those branded messages using advertising. So it's brand, identity, and logo are the three things we think about. And this is, frankly, if you're working in a branding agency, is how you'll think about any client you might have, whether they're newer and introducing a new brand like Infinity did back in '89, or let's say it's a long in the tooth brand that's been around for a long time and you're managing kind of the affairs of that brand. A guy named Tim Duncan from my industry, I was actually I worked for Briggs & Stratton for a long time, and then others, but essentially worked in the power tool category. A lot of times my products were more gasoline engine based, but Tim Duncan was the president and CEO of Positech Tool Corporation. Prior to that, he worked for the industry, right? But he had a crazy idea to start his own company, and it was a bit of a risk to do that. But what I want to share with you guys about Tim Duncan is just sort of his view on branding. So let's break that down a little further. Some thoughts from Tim Duncan, the president and CEO of Positech Tool Corporation, who kind of a genius, actually, in a way. He said that branding includes much more than marketing communication, especially much, much more than traditional advertising and promotion. What it really is brand building, and it's taking into account all of the brand consumer touch points, all, capital ALL, interactions between consumers and brands. So it's not just when they go to the store and kick the tires on a car or a product. It's every point between buying and the first acknowledgement of a brand's existence. Everything a company brand does, and sometimes what it doesn't do, sends a brand message, is what he says, and I think that's accurate. So here's another way of looking at this. Everything sends a brand message. So I won't read all of these here, but things like email correspondence, how people answer the phone, the voice tone, what you say. I bank at Wells Fargo, and they're fond of saying, "Hey, thank you for being a customer since X," and they'll tell me what year I started banking with Wells Fargo. One example of branding. Brochures, logos, certainly all the collateral stuff you do. Anytime you have a gift you send to clients, any direct mail stuff, any advertising you do of any kind. Again, any touch point, which essentially is any time a person may have any thought or interaction with the brand, even like when the phone rings, all kind of talks about what he's talking about there, which is the consumer touch points. Another way of looking at this, internal versus external touch points. The book touches on this. So internal touch points are those things you do behind the scenes to create this branded experience. So things like stationary letterhead, right? Business forums, proposals, all of that stuff. The internet, the intranet, anything that has the brand on it that is either something that you encounter as an employee or somewhere backstage where it all kind of tells you, reminds you what the brand's all about. So that anybody who works with the brand or for the brand is swimming in the same direction. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, the external touch points are really the stuff that consumers see, the folks that are already part of your brand, and maybe the folks that you wish would be a part of the brand. You're trying to entice them to come into the fold with the rest because the water's just fine. So things like word of mouth, direct mail, promotions, newsletters, anything for an IMC campaign, frankly, that you'll see as a part of these external touch points. And that kind of rolls up to, on either side of that, what's known as the brand essence. So another way of capturing this is what Tim Duncan said. He said your entire company should be considered your branding department. Now that's kind of cliched. Lots of folks say that, and a lot of companies say that, and don't really execute against that. I would say there's some companies that really do a great job of doing that, like Zappos, and we'll talk about Zappos in an upcoming slide here, but Zappos does a really nice job of promoting their basic idea, which is heavy focus on customer service. All right, so let's talk about the power of brand. If you guys don't believe that the brand has power, let's kind of illustrate that a little bit here. So here's an example, right? Often you can do this, and this will kind of illustrate to you why people pay more for brands versus non-brands. So let's take two identical cereals tasted by consumers, right? Let's say it's the same, and a lot of times companies do this. Kellogg's will sell their product to an off-brand, and it's the same product with a different brand on it, or it doesn't have a brand, right? So let's say Kellogg's versus no brand. In this case here, side by side on the shelf, and Kellogg's, let's say Kellogg's is probably a buck more. People 59% of the time will choose Kellogg's because of the experience they've had over the many years that they've been buying those products. So there's a brand preference that happens, even though price. So it helps overcome price objectivity or price objection. Another example: identical TV sets examined by consumers. Right. So you got Hitachi versus GE. Now people think often GE makes great products, and they do. I would say GE does, and I worked with a GE brand for many years. GE is known for two types of products: the kind that you find in hospitals, right, which failure is not an option. And the other kind you might find at a department store where they've kind of sullied the brand a little bit. They've put the brand in a lot of things, and I know this when I started working with the brand long ago. I went out and bought a few different products. I bought a wireless phone for my house, and I bought two of them, and they both broke. So GE kind of didn't do their homework there, I would say, based on my experience with it. But versus Hitachi, right? Hitachi, and I would also put Samsung on there too, just to see you. But in this case, people are willing to pay $75 more for a Hitachi than a GE TV. So another example there where brand has some power and some cachet, and it really does sway consumers' decision making. So how are they created? And we'll talk about that next. And I've actually had some experience with this, so we'll talk about my example, but let's talk about the 3 steps. First one is determining the desired brand position. So where is it going to be in the pantheon of other brands? Where can it live and be successful? And then, of course, and so you got to find that spot, the sweet spot for the brand. If there's too many brands kind of competing for that same positioning statement, like, for example, a luxury brand, right? Infiniti came in with Mercedes, BMW, and a few other high-end luxury brands, but they were able to compete fairly well based on their positioning. Sometimes it's pretty crowded, so you want to find a space for a product that can fit and live and breathe amongst the other brands. And then, of course, once you've done that, you want to develop the brand ID, and I'll break that down for you in a second here. Along the way with that, of course, is also creating a brand image of sorts. So here's my example. I worked for Briggs & Stratton. I was actually a part of a team that helped create a new brand from scratch. We had at Briggs & Stratton at the time, when I was there, for pressure washers and generators, a need for what's called a house brand, a brand that we could create and put on our products that helped us differentiate within different channels. So a channel meaning Lowe's versus Home Depot, for example. We had a few others as well. TSC Tractor Supply was one client we had, or company we had that we sold products through. So we had to create differentiation the best we could. Now, that was a challenge because innovation wasn't always there in spades. So one of the things we did was create a new brand that was exclusive to, I believe in this case, TSC back in the day, Tractor Supply. But we created Brute from scratch, basically, and went through a lot of iterations on the logo and the packaging and all of the appointed sort of decals and everything else. That's what we're talking about when we talk about brand ID, the middle one here. And of course, along the way, then you get this brand image, and Brute became a very popular brand. So I'm proud to say I was part of that team, and now you see Brute out there in select stores as a brand for pressure washers, generators, and lawnmowers. But that doesn't happen overnight, right? But you can do it. People can create brands from scratch, and now you've got a new brand. The thing I want to mention too is just thinking about brands and how they play, and we talked about where the positioning is, where the desired brand is positioned. Charts like these are kind of what we look at a lot of times here, right? Just to give you a feel for what people think about brands in different ways, and you have a vertical and horizontal axis for each of these here. In this case, we're looking at fast food, right? So healthy foods, right? Subway owns that space, and that's great. Good for Subway, right? Nobody's really competing against them for healthy. And of course, the other is kind of clustered in the middle there. You really want to be out in a space there where you really can target. Again, we talked about this, owning a space in a consumer's mind. Subway really owns not only fresh, but I would say also healthy, because they give you very clear information about the calories and all that stuff. That's why you see Subway kind of upper right corner there versus McDonald's, which is now for kids and also for more junk food. Another example of that, again, in this case here, the metrics are lots of locations, and Subway and McDonald's compete very well there. So you see that. Here's another example again. This time looking at Gap. Where does Gap fall? And this is a little bit dated, but nonetheless you get the idea. It's more illustrative than anything else. Where does Gap fall in the fashion value equation? So here, Gap, if you see that, lower middle right quality. It's not very expensive, somewhat basic. I would almost put Gap above the line there. Not expensive certainly, but maybe a little bit more fashion conscious than your average brand. H&M certainly low cost. If we ever shopped at H&M, none of that clothes fits me anyway, so I don't go there. But H&M obviously low cost, high fashion value, and so on and so forth. So you see all of these brands and where they fit in the pantheon. This is basically data that brands use and do research on to make sure they know where they're positioning their products. And this is how you kind of think about your brands. Another example again too, this time with beer, shows in this case here how brands kind of play in that space. And is Budweiser aspirational? I would say certainly looking at some of their advertising. You think about Best Buds, the ad where you show the Clydesdales and the puppy, right? And that certainly tugs on a lot of heartstrings. And that, I think, has a lot to do with why Budweiser is seen more aspirational than maybe a Miller or Coors or certainly Old Milwaukee. All right, so this research here kind of leads to what we call insights, right? And we look for these insights. And again, using the BMW example, right? The ultimate driving machine really was the sweet spot for that brand. They came to learn that after kind of making a mistake and getting rid of that and coming back to it. But other things you can do is thinking about kind of your target audience as well. In this case here, stakeholder overlap, right? And this is for a bank, this example. And what they discovered was that 75% of owned shares of the bank stock, marketers must make sure that the brand messages are acceptable to all stakeholders and that the presentation of the brand image and position is consistent with all these groups. So they found that 95% of the bank employees were also bank customers. That's something that it was an aha moment for them. That most of the folks who worked there were also customers. So that kind of changed the perception of how they approach the marketplace. But those are the insights that you get when you do research. All right, let's talk about brand equity for a moment, shall we? Brand equity is an important piece. It's why we do what we do when we do branding. So in this case, we're going to use 3 brands to illustrate this here. And these are 3 high-end brands, I would say, so they have a lot of equity. Yeti, that middle one, that blue stove there, is an overpriced Viking stove. And, of course, Cristal Champagne, which I've never had, but their per bottle is really expensive. And the brand is something that people kind of resonate to. If you see a lot of rappers and folks always kind of hoisting up a bottle of Cristal because it's expensive and good and all that fun stuff. But a brand's power is derived from the goodwill and name recognition that is earned over time, which is really what brand equity is, right? And this translates to higher sales volume and also, of course, higher profit margins. Now, the nice thing about these brands, a Yeti cooler, for example, you don't have to sell that many to make a lot of money because the margins are really good because Yeti coolers are expensive, as are Viking stoves and, of course, Cristal Champagne. So obviously, that's kind of lucrative. Now, think about some of the brands you find at Walmart. You're probably not going to find Cristal or a Viking stove, or maybe you'll find a Yeti, but I doubt it. Maybe you'll find a version of the Yeti that's cheaper, but at Walmart. But generally, that's not their play, right? Walmart is more about low cost and marginal increases in sales margin for the company. Whereas Viking stoves can certainly sell a couple. If you're a Viking stove salesperson, you might sell 4 or 5 a month, maybe if you're lucky, and that's enough to live on and certainly do well. But at the end, it's the power of the brand, right? People have to have a Viking stove. Quick story: a buddy of mine doesn't even cook at home, but he's well-to-do and he's got a Viking stove. So just so you know, that's a pristine-looking stove because they always eat out, but it's a status symbol, and that's kind of the power of brand and brand equity. More on brand equity. The value of the brand in the marketplace. A high equity brand has high value in the marketplace. It's easily recognizable when encountered, right? So in other words, when you see the Yeti cooler, you know you're going to get something that holds, keeps ice and keeps things cold for a very long time, and it's also a status symbol. One of the first recalled when a relevant prompt is used, right? So in other words, if you say something that relates to the brand, they're going to say, oh, that's Cristal or that's Yeti. Individuals would be willing to pay a premium price for your brand's offering, right? Money's no object for some of these brands. They just have to have Cristal or they have to have X. And when someone asks for a referral, your brand is the first one that is recommended. So here's an example I want to share with you guys from my personal story. Quickly, I'll say this. I did marketing for generators, specifically portable and standby generators. Well, one of the customers we had was Home Depot, and they basically said that they didn't like the Briggs brand on the products. They wanted something else. So ergo and therefore, we shopped around, and actually we were asked by GE to pick up the product and the brand because GE didn't make standby residential generators. So in other words, they didn't make products that we make. This slide gave them all the confidence in the world that they would be successful. Here's why. It's what's known as aided versus unaided awareness. In this case here, unaided awareness is what's at play. I'll explain. So when you ask somebody about standby generators, and I'll give you a quick understanding what they are. They are these boxes that contain an engine and an alternator, and a turbine that creates electricity for your home. Bolts onto your home automatically and comes on and off when the power goes out, right? So the problem with that is there was very low penetration, which means only 2% at that time. I think it's still probably 2 or 3%, even know the product exists. So what you do then is you ask them, all right, if it did exist, which brands would you think would make these products? And invariably, GE, when we asked that question, GE came out on top by a large margin, followed by Honda at 63%, Craftsman, and then, of course, Honda and Craftsman don't make the product, by the way, nor did GE. Briggs & Stratton was the first company so we did pretty well, our brand, but they, obviously didn't know that. They were just saying, all right, I would think that these brands would make that. So John Deere, Cat, Coleman, which did make the product for a while, and then they stopped. Troy-Bilt doesn't. Kohler, Cummins, and Generac, the bottom three there, were our three biggest competitors. So this is the power of the brand, right? So we felt emboldened by this, and when we picked up the GE brand, we felt like people innately were going to say, well, why? Of course GE makes this product. And I'm going to trust GE because I know GE is a trustful brand. They kind of have a heritage and power. So that was our positioning and our thinking behind leasing the GE brand for our Briggs products. So again, that's the power of the brand from my experience. I encourage you guys to watch this as well. Really fascinating stuff here. This quick video, which is in this week's folder for Canvas, kind of shows you from 2000 to 2018 kind of the evolution of some of these brands. And you'll see, for example, you'll watch the precipitous fall of Coca-Cola. Why is that? Because most likely millennials are not drinking sugary sodas as much as they used to. In fact, they are very health conscious. So that is intuitively what tells me why Coca-Cola is dropping. So see that as well. You'll see a few others that you don't even see on here yet, but Amazon is nowhere to be found, and you'll see at the end, Amazon, as we approach 2018 here in this video, is just a fast riser. Other ones you'll see BMW come up and go down against Mercedes-Benz, which has more of a steady growth. But watch each of these brands, have fun with this video. It kind of shows you, and you can almost kind of stitch together the story of what's going on with each of these brands based on some of the things that are happening. So, but it's good to think about it in this way. And each of these brands, by the way, too, obviously the value is massive for each of these brands. All right, so back to building brands. One thing you'll do is, and you'll do this in this class in the upcoming weeks here, is you'll write a brand manifesto. And what that is it's something that's not necessarily published, although sometimes you see them published in articles and magazines and things like that, but it really is a written sort of narrative description of the brand and its true personality. So in other words, it states the mission, vision, and value statements for the brand. And what it really is, and you'll see a couple examples I got queued up here, the soul and voice of the brand. And it provides an active collective voice for folks to kind of rally around. It's not as not an ad necessarily, and not seen often by the public, although sometimes these things escape because of people like me, frankly. But and what it really does is it inspires the brand, and especially it inspires IMC campaigning. So here's an example of one for Levi's. This is a few years ago, right? But when all is said and done, have you done or said enough? Have you just gone for the ride, along for the ride, or have you steered destiny's hot rod? When you leave this world, did you make it any better than it was when you arrived? All you need is all you've got, your wits and the clothes on your back. Your epitaph is yours to earn. Your legacy is yours to make. Now is our time. And this is, of course, a clarion call to younger folks to continue embracing the Levi's brand. So go forth is their mantra, and this is what we'd call brand manifesto. A couple more examples here. There's another example of Levi's, the Go Forth Manifesto. I'm not going to read all of these here, but of course Apple has something that kind of stands for their products. And a lot of times you'll read these things too to engage potential employees as well. And why do you need a manifesto? Because it's a grandstand for where your brand stands. Something called brand archetypes. This is interesting because it gets into the psychology behind these brands and what they stand for. So this little wheel here, and you'll see a number of examples if you do any research on brand archetypes. But what does the brand stand for in the mind of the consumer? And each of these have what these archetypes, right? It's just a deeper sort of emotional, sometimes often unspoken, and often people aren't aware that they feel a certain way about a brand until you discuss it and think about it. But some character types appear again and again in literature, myth, and storytelling. For example, let's take a look at Lego. Obviously, that's creator. And the creator is sort of somebody who likes to make things, right? Versus Nike, the hero, and so on and so forth, right? So each of these has a sort of mystique about them that should guide your decision making around any IMC campaign and the kind of the tone and tenor you take with the brand. These personality types help explain and define your brand in a meaningful way, an emotional way. A couple more examples, right? Thinking about this again, these are there's a lot of different ways to think about each of these brands, but here are some examples I want to share with you guys, and some brands that kind of fit these. So brands that are explorers: North Face, Pier 1, Jeep, Greyhound. Brands that are defenders: U.S. Army, Greenpeace, Marlboro, Dial, and Band-Aid. Brands that are thrill-seeking: X Games, Mountain Dew, Chrysler, Crossfire, and you may take issue with some of these and maybe have your own brands. But what you really want to do is, like, when you think about a brand, kind of find the sweet spot for your brand archetype, and some of these other ones here. Traditionalist, right? Some brands, Old Spice, which I would say maybe not so much anymore. This is maybe a little dated. The Old Spice now came out with some kind of edgy ads over the last 10 years. Wendy's, Procter & Gamble, the Nurturer brand, Campbell's, certainly soup, right? Good food. Pampers, Volvo, Johnson & Johnson, etc. The Connector brand, AT&T, certainly. Verizon, any phone company could be put under here. Facebook and LinkedIn, certainly. And then, of course, the artists, brands that stand for artistry, creativity, and craftsmanship. HP, Adobe, certainly. Lego, Home Depot, and others. So you get the idea here. You can look through all of these. I'm not going to spend all the time on this, but if you're interested, these are all up there on Canvas. And some of these are really kind of interesting, and maybe so you might take issue with some of these either way because it's a little bit dated. But that's how we start thinking about brands. Let's say, for example, you're an account person and you suddenly become the account manager for, let's say, the Red Cross, right? So that's a servant brand, lower right corner there. You'll start thinking about the brand in those terms. So some aspects now. How do you cultivate the brand over time? So this is another thing to think about. Again, let's say you're the agency of record who gets picked to manage the Red Cross brand, right? Which has been through ups and downs. And Red Cross obviously is a brand that's a bit dated and maybe lost its way a bit. So managing those relationship aspects, right? Consistency of the brand is important. So if I'm the brand manager or I'm the agency working for Red Cross, I want to make sure there's consistency across the board. I'm always going to be watching to make sure that if I've got a tagline or if I've got a brand book guideline that needs to be followed and it's not being followed, it needs to be changed and consistent over time. Certainly accessibility, right? You want to make sure people have access to the brand and responsiveness to, and that gets back to some of the social media stuff we see nowadays where people maybe make comments. And does the brand stand? Is the brand authentic, and does the brand stand up when something goes bad? Or is it one of those brands that hides its head in the sand? And then, of course, commitment. So if you say one thing, this is something a lot of brands do. They say they're one thing, they're not really what they say they are, which is tremendously important to a lot of younger folks these days, especially that. Does the brand have something they're committed to? And are they authentic in their goals with that commitment? So that's from the company. So this is the things that the companies do, right? Now, from the consumer, and a lot of times this stuff now, brands are owned by consumers more and more these days with the advent of social media and digital marketing. Especially, brands have had to relinquish control to some degree to their constituents. So toward that end, people will give you their endorsement if they trust, they like, and they feel satisfied with your brand. And that's, again, like I said, playing out in a big way now on social media and other venues. But the fact that consumers have now taken control more and more of what the brand stands for gives them us consumers a more critical role in the evolution of a brand. So let's break this down a little further here. Maintaining the relationships is critical, right? Either side of the football. So in other words, from the brand side and from the client side, or not client, but rather the consumer side. So top of the funnel here, existing brands account for most of the brand communication with consumers. Moving down here, selling to existing consumers is much less costly than attracting new customers. So that's one of those caveats we know about branding, right? So we want to maintain those existing customers as much as we can. Now, obviously, when I moved from BMW to Infiniti, that was unfortunate for BMW. Now, I still love BMW, but I did defect. So the goal here is it's cheaper, and the statement here is it's cheaper or less expensive to maintain your existing customers than to go out and find new ones. Down from there, current heavy users typically account for most of the brand's revenue. That's the 80-20 rule. A big fact there is that 80% of your 20% of your customers will be 80% of your sales. And that's invariably true of most things. And again, it's called a Pareto analysis. Not on any test, but know that that's what we look at as well. We always look for ways to leverage that 20%, those folks who are heavy users of the brand. And the bottom there, loyal word of mouth advocates can be highly persuasive with other consumers. So that's the end of the loop there, where once you've sold and you've made somebody happy with your brand, you want to unleash the power of advocacy. In other words, you want to do friends and family campaigns, and you want to make it really easy for folks to share their positive experiences with others. And that's how you really grow a brand, frankly, with this advocacy piece. And again, especially given now we know social media is being so important as a part of that. Another thing that lots of brands do, and I've had some experience with CRM as well, not the greatest always, because it's not easy for old companies to adopt these, but Salesforce.com is one of many examples where you have some tools in your toolbox that you can use to manage those relationships with consumers and customers, right? So again, the 80-20, right? A CRM, Salesforce will tell you who those 20% are buying 80% of your products. And they'll also tell you who the deadbeats are, who are not buying a lot of products. They maybe bought once and haven't bought again in quite some time. And that'll tell you either you cut bait on them or maybe you try to find a way to kind of reinvigorate them. But it gives you a clue as to where your best customers are, and by extension, how you go about reaching out to them in a meaningful way. And CRM tools are kind of all about that, managing those relationships. And that's really, really critically important to ongoing brand relations. I think I touched on this already, but Zappos really stands for customer service personified. Right now, there's shoes. It started with shoes, and they all have all kinds of products on there now. But they have built their reputation on exemplary customer satisfaction and support online. We'll play this here. This is kind of a little spoof here. We're kind of wrapping up our focus on branding here, but we'll pivot on this here after a little bit. Actually, I want you to watch this video. I'm going to just have you watch this video. This is a generic brand video in Canvas. It's a short video, but it's meant to be a spoof on branding. And I guess the caveat here for this is a generic brand video, is just that. Brands can fall into the trap of saying the same thing other brands say. So don't fall into that trap. Authenticity is really critically important for lots of brands these days, and being unique and standing out from the rest. And this video kind of gets at some of the brand generic brands that you see out there. All right, so last couple slides here, and we're gonna we'll wrap up for this week here. I'd like you to watch what is the work you can't not do, and we're going to be talking specifically about personal branding when we get through this part here. Okay, so this guy here, Scott Dinsmore, it's great. Obviously, he's somebody who went through an epiphany in his life, his young life, was working in a dead-end job, and decided he wanted to do something completely different and followed his passion, right? I'm encouraging you guys to do the same thing here. But he kind of took stock in his own self, and that's what I'm going to ask you guys to do with this personal brand exercise this week, due on Sunday. And it's a guide, right? It's built for you guys specifically to use, to download, and to type right into. So what I'd like you to do is kind of go through each of these little vignettes. There's 3 big buckets here, actually 4 big buckets that I'd like you to kind of take time on and work on. And it's something I want you to have and to hold, right? It's kind of like your resume in a way. It's what you stand for. And you're basically creating your own personal brand. We are, as account folks, really meant to manage our own brands as well. And that's really important, I would say, especially as you start interfacing with clients. What do they say about you? What do they say? Was he wearing a tie? Does he look kind of slobby? Does he come late? All of these things kind of build up to your own personal brand as well. So whereas there's big brands like BMW and some of the other brands we've talked about, Coca-Cola and many of these other brands we know and love, I would say I would encourage you guys with this exercise to take it seriously and to manage and cultivate your own brand as well. And this is a starting point for you to do that. It's a line in the sand. Now, this is something that will probably change over time, similar to amendments that you'd see in the Constitution, right? Over time, we made amendments to the Constitution because they were needed. You're going to probably learn a lot about yourself if you start thinking about your own brand and some of the things. But let's get a line in the sand with this personal brand exercise. That's due on Sunday, like I said, 11:59. Take some time on this. I'll be interested in reading those and providing comments back to you guys on that as well. This will start with a fun little projective technique. If your brand were a celebrity, who would it be? My case here, I would, it sounds like I'm touting my own horn here, but I like celebrities who are funny. So for me, John C. Reilly, and what made me laugh the most about him is just anything he's in. He makes me laugh, and he's a great actor. Loved Step Brothers, but that would be my selection for that, and so on and so forth. If my brand were an animal, I would be a flying squirrel, just because I think that's cool. The fact that a squirrel can, climb a tree and also leap from one tree to another, and kind of, it's not really a flying squirrel, it's more of a gliding squirrel. But anyway, flying squirrel would be my choice there. What is your first word that pop into mind when somebody hears your name? I want them to feel happy, right? Happiness. What is the one word you never want to associate with that? Untruthful, I guess, is the word I would choose for that. And my brand walks into a party, how does it introduce itself? I'm not the guy to wear a lampshade on my head because I've had too much to drink, but I would say I'm a kind of an extrovert / introvert, rolled up into one. I value my alone time quite a bit, but when I'm in a party situation, I tend to draw attention to myself through humor. That's just how I am, which drives my wife crazy, by the way, because she's a complete introvert. So she would be kind of fringier at a party, whereas I'd be the one kind of driving conversations and making sure everybody's happy and connected and having a good time. So that's me. That's the first thing you guys will do with this brand book, right? I'd like you to take a stab at your own version of this, and we'll take a look at that. All right, so that's kind of what's due. The book selection, book report, that's the last thing I want to mention. Obviously, by Thursday this week, due at 11:59. Most of you guys got that in. I'll give you feedback on that, whether or not I greenlight that. And then, of course, your personal brand workbook, which is due on Sunday. That's all I got for this week. Good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. Shoot me an email if you do. And we'll talk to you in week 5. Thanks a lot.